Hey guys, tonight we're gliding into one of those oddly quiet stories from the Gilded Age. So dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little tighter and settle in. We're going to talk about an American heiress who shocked everyone by saying no. No to Europe's most eligible bachelor. A man who was not just wealthy, not just aristocratic, but yes, an actual prince. You'd think, who on earth says no to that? Especially in the late 19th century, when American millionaires were practically shoving their daughters across the Atlantic to marry into dusty old European titles. It was the era of what people like to call the dollar princesses. Young women whose job was basically to swap railroad and oil money for coronets and castles. But this one heiress said no. She didn't do it for romance. She didn't do it for rebellion. She did it because her family fortune came with a secret, one that wasn't about money at all, but something far more awkward. Something that made her quietly, permanently unmarriageable. So let's float slowly into her story. The late 19th century in America, the Gilded Age, was a strange time. The name alone tells you everything. Gilded, shiny on the surface but hollow underneath. Imagine enormous houses dripping with chandeliers, gold leaf staircases, imported marble floors. And inside them, men who had gotten rich off railroads, steel, oil, or occasionally just creative accounting. They were called robber barons behind their backs, but to themselves, they were America's new aristocracy. And of course, what good is being an aristocrat without the matching accessories? In Europe, that meant centuries-old coats of arms. But in America, where history stretched back maybe 3 family generations, you had to buy your way into the image of nobility, which meant castles in Newport, elaborate balls, diamonds sewn into gowns, and most importantly, daughters who were expected to marry well. Not marry Americans, of course. That would have been too normal. No, the trend was to ship them across the Atlantic to snag impoverished dukes, barons, earls, and sometimes, if you were lucky enough, a spare prince. Because nothing says, my fortune is secure, like grafting it onto a faded European dynasty that desperately needed your cash to repair a roof or two. This was the social climate into which our heiress was born. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. And no, I didn't just mispronounce something, although you'll probably want to, because the spelling alone looks like someone threw Scrabble tiles across the floor. She was born in New York in 1853, the daughter of a Cuban sugar baron and a socially ambitious mother. Right from the start, Consuelo had all the ingredients for the Gilded Age fantasy: exotic roots that made her stand out in stuffy drawing rooms, a sizable fortune, and just enough beauty that society columnists like to call her striking. Which, let's be honest, is often code for, we're not sure if she was actually pretty, but she had great posture. Now the Vanderbilt family had all the right money, but not all the right pedigree. Old New York families, the Astors, the Livingstons, the Schuylers, they didn't really think Cuban sugar fortunes counted as respectable. But Consuelo's mother wasn't about to take no for an answer. She pushed her daughter right into the highest circles, staging parties, dinners, and plenty of carefully arranged encounters with eligible bachelors. And it worked. Consuelo wasn't just accepted. She became one of the leading socialites of the 1870s. Which is exactly when Europe came calling. Because across the Atlantic, there were plenty of blue-blooded young men who were looking around and realizing their family estates were well collapsing. Centuries of inbreeding had not exactly produced financial geniuses. Many of these men had palaces with 50 rooms but couldn't afford to heat them. Some had castles with actual holes in the roofs. And suddenly, here was a wave of American women arriving with trunks full of dresses and bank accounts that practically dripped with gold. You can see where this is going. Consuelo was soon courted by none other than George Victor, the Prince of Wide. Now you probably haven't heard of him. That's fine, most people haven't, but at the time, he was considered a pretty solid catch. He was German royalty, related to half the crowned heads of Europe by some twisted family tree that probably required a diagram, and he was in the market for a wife. On paper, it was perfect. An American fortune meets a European title. The newspapers whispered, Society ladies gasped, and everyone expected Consuelo to walk down the aisle toward a life of tiaras, palaces, and endless curtsies. But she didn't. This is where things get interesting. Consuelo flatly refused to marry the prince, not even a polite excuse, not even a maybe later, just no, and that was scandalous, because who on earth says no to a prince, especially when your mother has spent her entire adult life grooming you for exactly this? Society spun out a dozen theories. Maybe she didn't like him, maybe she secretly loved someone else, maybe she was staging a dramatic rebellion against her mother. But the truth, whispered quietly among those who knew her best, was more tragic. Consuelo had inherited something along with her family fortune, a genetic condition, tuberculosis. Now today when we think of tuberculosis, we think of coughing in Victorian novels. But in the 19th century, it was a death sentence. It was also highly contagious, which meant that for a woman, marriage was complicated. Having children was almost impossible, and for a European prince looking for an heir, well, you can see the problem. Consuelo knew it, and rather than marry into royalty and unleash an international scandal when she inevitably couldn't fulfill her role as a wife and mother, she quietly stepped back. She said no. And society didn't know what to do with that. Let's pause here and reflect, because this moment really captures the weirdness of the Gilded Age. Everyone around Consuelo was obsessed with appearances. Big houses, big weddings, elaborate family trees. But underneath the surface, the reality was messy. These so-called perfect marriages were often disasters. American heiresses were miserable in drafty castles. European nobles were bitter about their rich wives. And yet, the machine kept turning. Consuelo, in her quiet refusal, actually stepped off that machine. Not for rebellion, not even for freedom, just because she knew what lay ahead for her was illness, and she didn't want to drag a prince down with her. And that's oddly dignified. She eventually did marry, but not a prince. She chose Alva Belmont's brother-in-law, William Kissam Vanderbilt. Yes, that Vanderbilt. Because in Gilded Age New York, you couldn't really escape the web of the mega-rich families. And if you couldn't have a title, marrying into one of the richest railroad dynasties in America was a decent consolation prize. But here's the twist. Consuelo's marriage wasn't happy either. William was charming, yes, but he was also a Vanderbilt, which meant he was more interested in yachts and horse races than in a wife who was quietly dying of tuberculosis. Their relationship limped along, strained by her illness and by the fact that William, like so many Gilded Age husbands, was more interested in showing off than settling down. Consuelo spent much of her married life drifting between health resorts, seeking the clean air and rest cures that doctors prescribed for tuberculosis. But none of it really worked. She faded slowly, her beauty dimmed by illness, her once sparkling social presence replaced by quiet withdrawal. By the time she died, in 1909, at the age of 56, she was remembered less for her brief moment as a would-be princess, and more as one of those tragic figures who seemed to embody the darker underside of the Gilded Age. But let's not get too heavy, because in many ways, Consuelo's story is almost refreshing. She didn't follow the script. She didn't trade herself for a crown. She refused the fairy tale, and in doing so, she revealed what those fairy tales really were, just transactions dressed up in lace and diamonds. Her story is also a reminder that behind every glittering heiress in a ballroom, there was usually something fragile: illness, unhappiness, secrets that money couldn't actually fix. And so, when you hear about the Gilded Age and its dollar princesses, think of Consuelo Isnaga, the heiress who refused to marry a king, not because she didn't want to, but because she quietly knew she couldn't. Now, while we're here, let's drift a little sideways, because Consuelo wasn't the only heiress whose story took a strange turn. The entire generation of Gilded Age socialites was filled with mismatched marriages, unhappy unions, and dynastic disasters. And since we're already tucked in, we might as well glide into another one of those stories.
So we've tucked Consuelo Isnaga back into her silk-lined corner of history, the heiress who said no to a prince. And honestly, her quiet refusal makes a nice contrast with what most of her peers were doing at the exact same time. Because while she was stepping aside, dozens of other American heiresses were stepping onto steamships, heading for Southampton, Le Havre, or any European port with a castle within day-trip distance. They weren't going for the sightseeing. They were going husband hunting, or to be a little less polite, their mothers were doing the hunting for them. Let's just say matchmaking was less about candlelit glances and more about financial ledgers. The late 19th century was peak dollar princess season. That phrase wasn't coined affectionately, by the way. European aristocrats used it with a mixture of condescension and relief. Relief because the cash was coming. Condescension because, well, what could possibly be worse than marrying some brash American girl whose father had made his fortune in railroads? It was, in their eyes, marrying down. But money has a funny way of smoothing out snobbery. And if your ducal palace roof had been leaking for 30 years and your ancestral stables smelled more like bankruptcy than horses, you could overlook the fact that your fiancé's father wore a cowboy hat and said, "Gee whiz." So Americans brought money, Europeans brought titles, the marriages happened, and the press ate it up.
The most famous of these heiresses, one you may have already heard of, was Consuelo Vanderbilt. Now, before you get confused, yes, I just talked about a Consuelo. This is a different one, because apparently, naming your daughter Consuelo was briefly a fashionable move among rich Americans, as if the name itself guaranteed European interest. This Consuelo was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, ironically, the very same Vanderbilt who had married Consuelo Isnaga. So yes, he named his daughter after his wife's friend, which is either affectionate or deeply weird, depending on how you want to read it. But back to the point. Consuelo Vanderbilt grew up as the glittering prize of New York society. Tall, slim, undeniably beautiful, and most importantly, absolutely loaded. And her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, was determined to cash in. Alva was one of the most ambitious social climbers of the Gilded Age. She built the family's enormous marble mansion on Fifth Avenue. She fought her way into Mrs. Astor's elite circle, basically by throwing a ball so extravagant that the Astors couldn't ignore her anymore. And she wasn't about to let her daughter marry just any old American. No, Alva had her eyes on something bigger, something European, preferably with a coronet attached. Which is how Consuelo Vanderbilt ended up engaged to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a man who was, by most accounts, not particularly lovable. Now the Duke had the pedigree. He was a descendant of John Churchill, the first Duke, who had been one of England's great military commanders. He had Blenheim Palace, a colossal estate so large it could swallow several Newport mansions whole, but he also had debts, and lots of them. Enter Consuelo Vanderbilt, or more accurately her dowry, $4 million in 1895 money. That's, well, let's just say it was enough to buy a palace roof or two. The marriage was arranged, and when I say arranged, I mean practically forced. Consuelo cried, she begged. She was in love with another man, an American, naturally, but her mother was unrelenting. Alva literally locked her daughter in her bedroom until she agreed. Because nothing says eternal happiness like emotional blackmail. The wedding took place in New York in 1895. It was massive. Thousands of curious onlookers crowded the streets outside St. Thomas Church. The bride wore pearls. The groom looked vaguely like he'd rather be at the dentist. And off they went to Blenheim Palace. Now here's the thing about Blenheim. It's beautiful, it's historic, it's enormous, but it's also how to put this gently, cold, drafty, and staffed by people who probably resented every American who ever stepped foot in it. Consuelo, who had grown up in gilded comfort in New York, suddenly found herself in the role of duchess, expected to smile politely at endless parades of tenants and dignitaries. She was miserable. The Duke was equally miserable. He had the money now, but apparently he found his American wife too independent, too outspoken, and well, too American. They had 2 sons, fulfilling the dynastic requirement. After that, the marriage fell apart. By the early 1900s, Consuelo had finally had enough. She separated from the Duke, then divorced him, scandalous at the time. And in a delicious twist of irony, her mother Alva later apologized to her, admitted she'd been wrong, which honestly is the least you can do after forcing your daughter into a loveless marriage with a man who just wanted the cash. Consuelo went on to live a far happier life with her second husband, Jacques Bolson, a French aviator. She became a philanthropist, supported charities, and most satisfyingly, outlived the Duke by decades. So, lesson learned? Not really, because the flood of dollar princesses didn't stop with her. Let's drift over to another one. Mary Later. If the name doesn't ring a bell, don't worry. She was the daughter of Levi Later, a Chicago department store magnate, which sounds less glamorous than it was. Department stores in the 19th century were like the Amazon empires of today. Enormous, profitable, and occasionally run by men with more ambition than tact. Mary, however, was quietly lovely, polite, graceful, the kind of girl society writers love to describe as serene, which is code for she wasn't going to make a scene at dinner. And she ended up marrying George Curzon, a British aristocrat who later became Viceroy of India. Now on paper this sounds like a fairy tale. The Viceroy of India lived in the Viceregal Lodge in Calcutta, which makes Downton Abbey look like a modest suburban home. Mary wore jewels that glowed under gaslight. She hosted elaborate balls attended by maharajas, generals, and every ambitious civil servant who wanted to be noticed. But reality, again, wasn't as kind. George Curzon was brilliant, yes, but he was also egotistical, self-important, and about as emotionally generous as a tax collector. He liked Mary's beauty, her poise, her quiet presence. What he didn't do was appreciate her as an actual human being. She was more like one of his trophies, something to show off in grand drawing rooms. Mary dutifully smiled. She bore him children. She played the role. And then, tragically, she died young, at just 36, of complications after childbirth. Curzon, who had treated her as ornamental for most of their marriage, was suddenly devastated. Which is a little like ignoring your houseplant until it dies, then sobbing about how much you loved the greenery. What ties these stories together is that strange blend of glamour and gloom. The Gilded Age heiresses were supposed to be the winners of their generation. Rich, admired, married into nobility, and yet, over and over, their lives played out like cautionary tales. They had castles, yes, but the castles were cold. They had titles, yes, but the titles came with duties, obligations, and endless family expectations. And the husbands, let's just say European nobles, were not known for their emotional warmth. The irony is that the American press adored these marriages. They wrote them up as triumphs, proof that American women were conquering Europe with their charm and wealth. What they didn't write was how lonely those women felt in drafty halls, surrounded by resentful servants and married to men who only saw dollar signs. By the turn of the century, the pattern was clear. American money had rescued dozens of European aristocratic families from ruin. Roofs got fixed, estates survived, titles endured for another generation. And American daughters, those dollar princesses, were left to quietly endure their roles, pearls around their necks, smiles frozen in place. Some adapted, some rebelled, some faded away, but the story was always the same underneath, gilded, glittering, and hollow. And so, as we glide further into this twilight history, let's leave Mary later and Consuelo Vanderbilt drifting in their marble palaces and Indian lodges. Because there are more, so many more, heiresses with sad eyes in portraits, duchesses who secretly cried in their drafty bedrooms, princesses who traded freedom for tiaras and realized too late that the trade wasn't worth it. In the next stretch, we'll meet a few more of them, each with her own strange, tragic, and occasionally ironic twist. So far, we've seen heiresses forced into cold castles, drafty palaces, and loveless marriages. But of course, things could always get worse, because sometimes the prince or duke wasn't just boring. Sometimes he was, let's call it, a full-time disaster. And yet, American heiresses married them anyway, because the titles sparkled just enough to hide the mess underneath. Let's drift into a few of those stories. First up, Jennie Jerome. Now, Jennie wasn't technically called a dollar princess because she was a little ahead of the official trend, but she fit the pattern perfectly. Born in Brooklyn in 1854, her father Leonard Jerome was a Wall Street financier with plenty of cash and zero pedigree, which meant New York high society didn't really want him. So naturally, he took his daughter abroad. Jennie was witty, charming, and by all accounts, extremely beautiful, which came in handy when she met Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough. Yes, that Churchill family, as in Winston. Jennie and Randolph fell into a whirlwind romance in 1873. They got engaged after 3 days. 3, which is the kind of decision you make when you're 19 and your frontal lobe is still under construction. But it worked, at least at first. They married. Jennie became Lady Randolph Churchill, and a year later she gave birth to Winston Churchill, who, spoiler alert, would eventually become Britain's most famous Prime Minister. So happy ending, not quite. Randolph Churchill turned out to be complicated, charming in public, volatile in private, financially irresponsible, and likely suffering from syphilis, which is not the kind of marital bonus anyone hopes for. Jennie, meanwhile, was restless. She was intelligent, glamorous, and not particularly interested in being a dutiful, quiet Victorian wife, which is how she ended up having affairs, lots of them, with men ranging from politicians to royals, allegedly even with Edward, the Prince of Wales. Yes, the man who later became King Edward VII. But Jennie wasn't just scandal, she was also ambitious. She poured her energy into advancing Winston's career. She hosted salons, she made introductions, she raised money for his campaigns, and without her, Winston might never have had the network that propelled him forward. So while her marriage was rocky, her role in history was strangely significant. An American heiress, drifting into British aristocracy and indirectly shaping the future of 20th century politics. Now, speaking of Edward VII, let's float over to him for a moment, because he, too, became a magnet for ambitious American women. As Prince of Wales, he was the ultimate social prize, rich, powerful, charming, and let's be honest, perpetually unfaithful. His mistresses were practically a who's who of society, and yes, several of them were Americans. One was Alice Keppel, though she wasn't an heiress in the Vanderbilt sense. Another was Mary later's contemporary, Lady Randolph's circle of friends. The point is, American women were everywhere in his orbit, and while none of them actually married him, their presence at his side symbolized the new reality. Europe might still have the crowns, but America had the allure and the money. But let's not lose track. We are still with the actual heiresses who did end up married to questionable men. Take Anna Good. Anna was the daughter of J. Good, one of the most notorious robber barons in American history. He made a fortune in railroads and finance, earning himself the nickname Mephistopheles of Wall Street. which, doesn't exactly scream trustworthy family man. Anna grew up in immense wealth, and like so many others, she set her sights on Europe. In 1895, she married Count Bonny de Castellane, a French aristocrat with impeccable lineage and zero money. The Castellane family was ancient, noble, and financially ruined. Bonny, however, was charming, and he saw Anna as the perfect solution. They married in Paris, and Anna's dowry immediately went toward restoring the Castellane lifestyle. Bonny spent lavishly on clothes, on parties, on an enormous mansion in Paris called the Palais Rose. It was modeled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles, because apparently nothing says financial responsibility like rebuilding a royal palace when you're already broke. Anna played the role of dutiful countess. She endured the extravagance, the endless socializing, the constant press attention, but eventually even she had her limits. Bonny's spending was insane, his affairs were blatant, and by 1906, Anna had had enough. She divorced him, which was a scandal in France. But Anna didn't stop there. In 1908, she married again, this time to Haley de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Duke of Sagan, another noble, another ancient name, and yes, technically related to the famous diplomat Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. But here's the kicker, Haley was Bonny's cousin. Because apparently, in European aristocracy, the dating pool was just one small, over-chlorinated pond. Anna's second marriage wasn't exactly blissful either. Haley was less extravagant than Bonny, but he came with his own baggage. The two had children, lived in relative comfort, but never really escaped the shadows of gossip. Still, Anna's story perfectly illustrates the pattern: American money, European titles, and a whole lot of unhappiness. Now, drifting away from France, let's look at Germany for a moment, because German princes, too, were not above the heiress hunting game. Clara Ward is a name worth pausing on. She wasn't quite in the same category as Vanderbilt or Good, but she was wealthy enough to attract attention. Born in Detroit in 1873, she inherited a fortune from her father, who made his money in lumber and railroads. Clara was just 16 when she married Prince Joseph of Caramanchime, a Belgian aristocrat. The press swooned. A teenage American marrying into European nobility, it was the dream, or at least the fantasy. But Clara didn't exactly settle into her new role. She grew bored of palace life. She wanted excitement, which is how she ended up running away with a Hungarian violinist named Rigo Janksi. Yes, she left her husband, her title, her fortune, and eloped with a traveling musician. The scandal was enormous. The newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Clara and Rigo toured Europe, performing music, posing for photographs, and scandalizing everyone. Eventually, the romance fizzled, as whirlwind elopements tend to do. Clara drifted through a series of other relationships, marriages, and scandals, becoming a kind of tragic celebrity figure. She died relatively young, in 1916, largely forgotten, except as a cautionary tale of what happens when a dollar princess refuses to stay in her assigned role. So by now, we've seen several versions of this story. The dutiful heiress forced into misery, the rebellious heiress running away, the pragmatic heiress marrying again and again, and the tragic heiress fading into obscurity. What unites them all is that sense of irony. They had everything society told them they should want: money, beauty, titles. And yet, the actual experience was so often disappointing. And maybe that's the real bedtime moral of these Gilded Age tales. The castles were cold, the jewels were heavy, the husbands were flawed, and the women themselves, who the newspapers painted as triumphant social climbers, were usually just tired. So let's drift onward, because we're not done yet. There are still more heiresses to meet, more marriages to unravel, and more dynastic oddities to gently pick apart. So far, we've floated through stories of money, titles, and castles that looked glamorous but felt drafty. But behind all of it, there's another thread we need to tug on, one that's less about jewels and more about genetics. Because by the late 19th century, a lot of European aristocrats were well inbred. Now, I don't mean that as an insult, I mean that literally. For centuries, the noble houses of Europe had kept their bloodlines pure by marrying within the same small circle of cousins, over and over, and by the Gilded Age, the results were showing. Some noblemen had jaws so misaligned they could barely chew. Others were frail, sickly, or prone to strange health issues, and the pool of eligible bachelors wasn't exactly improving with time. So when American money burst onto the scene, it wasn't just welcome, it was survival. Take the case of Prince Louis of Battenberg. He wasn't a disaster himself, actually. Louis was respectable enough, an officer in the British Royal Navy, competent, polite, and only moderately confusing in terms of family tree. But the Battenbergs were considered minor royals, not quite top tier. So when Louis fell in love with an English girl named Victoria of Hesse, there was mild shock. Victoria, by the way, was Queen Victoria's granddaughter, which made her royal enough to be choosy, but she adored Louis. They married in 1884, and here's the part that matters for us: Louis was broke. Enter the American heiress pipeline. His extended family members, various Battenbergs, Hesses, and other German cousins, leaned heavily on marriages with wealthy Americans. They didn't always make the headlines, but they quietly secured enough funds to keep the dynasties afloat. It's one of those details that gets smoothed over in the official biographies. But when you look at the household accounts, you see it. American money dripping into European family coffers, papering over centuries of bad financial decisions and worse breeding choices. But if Louis was the respectable version, let's contrast him with some less glamorous examples. One of the most infamous targets of heiress hunting was Prince Franz Joseph of Battenberg. He was considered eligible mostly because he was related to people with crowns, otherwise not so much. He had no money, a middling career, and the kind of personality society columnists politely called dull. And yet, for a time, American mothers dangled daughters in his direction, because the Battenberg name still had that magic sheen of royalty. Did those marriages work out? Not really. They tended to be short, strained, or quietly disastrous. Which brings us back to the irony. American fortunes were patching up dynasties that were already collapsing under the weight of their own family trees. Let's drift to Spain for a moment, because the Spanish royal family, too, had a reputation by the late 19th century, and it wasn't flattering. King Alfonso XII died young, leaving behind his pregnant widow, Queen Maria Cristina. Their son, Alfonso XII, was born posthumously in 1886, which already set the stage for a slightly tragic life. But more importantly, the Spanish royal bloodline had been inbreeding for centuries. By the time Alfonso XII grew up, his health wasn't great. His personality wasn't much better. And while he didn't marry an American heiress, plenty of people tried to arrange it. Spanish courtiers sniffed around U.S. fortunes, quietly asking if any young women might want to take a chance on a crown that came with bankruptcy and political instability. Shockingly, not many said yes. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Habsburgs were also facing a problem. The dynasty, famous for its protruding jaws and fragile health, wasn't exactly producing robust heirs by the Gilded Age. Archdukes and archduchesses were still expected to marry within their tiny pool of cousins, which meant that when Americans offered cash, there was polite interest, but also hesitation. Because marrying outside the proper European circle was still seen as a little tacky. That didn't stop the gossip mills. More than once, rumors swirled that an archduke might marry an American heiress, but almost always the plan collapsed. The Habsburgs preferred to keep their crowns dull and their gene pool shallow. The British, however, were more pragmatic. By the time Edward VII became king in 1901, he had already watched his aristocratic friends patch their estates with American dollars for decades. The Marlboroughs had done it. The Curzons had done it. Even some minor royals had dipped into the heiress well. And Edward didn't mind. He saw it as part of the natural order. If the old nobility couldn't sustain itself, then let the Americans in, just as long as the titles survived. The irony, of course, is that Edward himself spent most of his life avoiding marital responsibility altogether. He had one wife, Queen Alexandra, but dozens of mistresses, which makes his approval of heiress marriages seem a bit hypocritical. But then, hypocrisy was practically a crown jewel in European courts. So, what did the Americans think of all this? Well, in the newspapers, they adored it. Every time a Vanderbilt or a good got engaged to a duke, the front pages lit up. It was proof that Americans had arrived. That money could buy not just mansions, but centuries-old respectability. Privately, though, the families often had regrets. The daughters were unhappy, the marriages strained, the castles cold, but once you were in, there was no easy way out. Divorce was scandalous, separation was frowned upon, and so many of these heiresses spent decades quietly enduring lives that looked glittering from the outside, but felt empty from the inside. Let's float back to the genetic angle for just a moment, because this part really deserves emphasis. The whole reason American heiresses were so appealing wasn't just the money, it was the fresh blood. European dynasties had intermarried for centuries. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. At one point, the Spanish Habsburgs had so many repeated marriages that their family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a badly tangled shoelace. By the 19th century, this had led to visible problems. Children who didn't survive infancy, adults who were chronically ill, mental instability whispered about in palace corridors. So when robust, healthy American young women arrived, with no history of cousin marriages behind them, it wasn't just about the dowries. It was also about the hope that their children might actually survive, thrive, and maybe even straighten out a crooked jawline or two. It's not romantic, but then again, neither were most of these marriages. And yet, even with all this inbreeding context, the cycle continued. Americans kept sending daughters, Europeans kept accepting dowries, and the machine kept turning. If there's one image that sums it up, it's this: a young woman in a glittering ball gown, standing in some enormous hall with ceilings 20 feet high. Everyone's smiling, the music's playing, the title's secured, and behind her eyes, there's that flat, tired look, the look of someone who knows the fairy tale isn't real. And so, as we sink deeper into this bedtime wander through dynastic disasters, let's leave the crumbling castles of Austria and Spain behind for now. Because next, we'll step into the early 20th century, when the dollar princess trend hit its peak, and when some marriages went so spectacularly wrong that even the newspapers couldn't spin them as happy endings. By the early 1900s, the heiress for title trade was running at full speed. If the late 19th century was the opening act, then the Edwardian era was the grand performance. American mothers weren't just hoping their daughters would marry into nobility. They were planning for it, grooming them for it, sometimes practically shipping them overseas with a little note pinned to their gowns that said, "One duke, please." And Europe was ready. Because at this point, the financial situation of the old aristocracy was dire. Farming revenues were collapsing. Industrialization had changed everything. Landed estates no longer generated what they once did, which meant dukes, earls and princes were wandering around their enormous properties, realizing they had thousands of acres and not enough cash to keep the roof patched. And then on the horizon, an ocean liner from New York, full of heiresses, problems solved. Let's start with Nancy Leeds. Nancy wasn't the daughter of a railroad baron or steel magnate. She was actually the widow of a tinplate tycoon, which may sound less glamorous, but tinplates made fortunes in the industrial era. Her husband, William Leeds, left her with an enormous pile of money when he died. Nancy took that fortune abroad, and after a few years of being one of the richest widows in Europe, she caught the attention of Prince Christopher of Greece and Denmark. Now, Prince Christopher was not exactly top of the royal food chain. He was the youngest son of King George I of Greece, which meant he had the title but not the cash. In fact, the Greek royal family was perpetually strapped for money, partly because Greece itself was perpetually strapped for money. So Nancy and Christopher married in 1920. She brought the fortune, he brought the title, and together they managed to live rather comfortably, which was not something Greek royals could usually say with a straight face. Nancy even got her own nickname, the Tinplate Queen, which is not, perhaps, the most romantic label in history, but it captured the essence of the arrangement. Then there was Maud Burke. Maud was a Californian, born in 1872, with an inheritance that made her one of the wealthiest young women of her circle, and she ended up married to Prince Francis of Teck. Now, Francis himself didn't make much of a splash, but his sister did, Mary of Teck, better known as Queen Mary, consort of King George V, which meant that Maud, an American girl from San Francisco, ended up the sister-in-law of the Queen of England. Not bad if you're counting social climbing as a sport. And then, of course, there were the Astors. The Astor family was one of the richest in America. Their fortune came from fur trading, then real estate, and eventually just being everywhere in New York society. The Astor name practically defined the Gilded Age. So naturally, when it came time for heiress marriages, the Astors played their part. One of the most famous cases was Mary Astor Paget. Another was Ava Astor, who married into the British peerage. These unions followed the same pattern we've seen over and over, money flowing east, titles flowing west. But perhaps the most striking Astor case was John Jacob Astor IV, though he flipped the script a little by marrying a younger woman, Madeline Force, who became a social scandal in her own right. But that's a side note in our story tonight. The main point is, by 1910, American heiresses were so common in European courts that nobody even blinked anymore. It was the norm. What makes this peak era so fascinating is how routine it became. Imagine the drawing rooms of London, Paris, or Vienna. Aristocratic mothers whispering, "Oh yes, she's the daughter of so-and-so, Vanderbilt, good, Astor Harriman," as if they were checking a stock exchange listing. The Americans brought energy, charm, and most importantly, dollars. The Europeans brought dusty titles, drafty houses, and the promise of social prestige. It was transactional, everyone knew it, and yet they all played along. But just because it was routine doesn't mean it worked out happily. One of the clearest examples comes from the story of Clara Huntington. She was the adopted daughter of Collies P. Huntington, one of the railroad magnates who practically owned half the tracks in America. Clara married into European nobility, thinking it would give her the glamorous life she'd been groomed for. Instead, she found herself in a marriage where her husband treated her fortune as his personal bank account. Parties, estates, endless social climbing, funded entirely by her inheritance. Clara, like so many others, discovered that titles came with a price, and the price was often personal happiness. It's worth pausing here to notice something. The press in America always reported these marriages as triumphs. "American girl marries Duke" was the kind of headline that guaranteed sales. Illustrations showed glowing brides, glittering jewels, castles in the background. It was all painted as victory, proof that America had risen to Europe's level or maybe even surpassed it. But if you dig even a little beneath those headlines, the reality was stark. Many of the heiresses were lonely. They were in foreign countries, often with limited friends, expected to conform to rigid aristocratic standards. They were outsiders. Their money was welcome, their personalities less so. Some adapted, some rebelled, some just quietly endured. And then came the turning point, World War I. When the war broke out in 1914, it changed everything. Suddenly, European aristocracy didn't look glamorous. It looked fragile. Castles were damaged. Fortunes collapsed further. Entire dynasties were overthrown, like the Romanovs in Russia, the Habsburgs in Austria, and the Hohenzollerns in Germany. For American heiresses, the appeal dimmed. Who wanted to marry into a family that might be dethroned next week? And on the American side, fortunes were shifting too. The Roaring Twenties brought a new kind of socialite, one who didn't need a title to feel powerful. Jazz clubs, Art Deco mansions, Hollywood glamour. Why freeze in a drafty British castle when you could throw parties in Palm Beach? So the age of the dollar princesses began to fade. But before it faded completely, there were still some spectacular late cases. For example, Barbara Hutton. She was the Woolworth heiress, the poor little rich girl with an almost unimaginable fortune. Barbara married repeatedly, including one marriage to a European prince, but none of them worked. Her life was a carousel of jewels, scandals, and heartbreaks, a kind of sad epilogue to the heiress era. Or Gloria Vanderbilt, famous in her own right later, but as a child, she was caught in the same cycle of social climbing, gossip, and family drama. Her custody battle in the 1930s became a media circus, proof that even when the titles stopped mattering, the chaos of heiress life never really went away. So when we look back on this peak period, what do we actually see? Not fairy tales, not triumphs, but transactions. American families wanted prestige, European families wanted money, and the young women in the middle were often treated as bargaining chips. Some made the best of it, some ran away, some faded quietly, but all of them remind us that the glittering surface of history almost always hides cracks underneath. And so, as we pull this section to a close, let's picture that last generation of heiresses boarding steamships, trunks full of gowns, mothers full of ambition, fathers writing checks, and across the ocean, dukes and princes waiting with outstretched hands, not for love, but for dollars. The marriages happened, the castles stayed patched, and the women themselves slipped quietly into portraits, remembered less for who they were and more for what they bought. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the transatlantic marriage market had started to lose its shine. The First World War had rattled Europe down to its foundations. Whole empires had collapsed. Aristocrats who once strutted confidently through gilded ballrooms were suddenly worrying about exile, unemployment, or, if they were Romanovs, simply survival. And across the ocean in America, the mood was changing too. The Gilded Age glamour was fading into something new, the Jazz Age. Flappers, speakeasies, Hollywood films. Suddenly, the idea of marrying some half-broke duke with a castle draftier than a train station seemed a lot less appealing. Why marry into a title when you could be photographed in Vogue or star in a movie? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The final act of the Dollar Princesses still had a few big names. One of the most glittering was Barbara Hutton. Born in 1912, Barbara was the Woolworth heiress. Her grandfather had founded the five-and-dime store empire, and when she came of age, she inherited a fortune estimated at around $50 million. which, for context, was so much money in the 1930s that people couldn't even wrap their heads around it. Barbara became known as the poor little rich girl. Her mother had died when she was young, her father was distant, and she grew up surrounded by money but starved for affection, which, of course, is a recipe for a lifetime of disastrous relationships. In 1933, Barbara married Prince Alexis Mdivani, a Georgian nobleman with old-world charm and very little else. He was part of what the press nicknamed the Marrying Mdivanis, a family of exiled nobles who made a cottage industry out of wooing wealthy heiresses. They weren't really princes in the reigning sense, more like aristocrats on the go. Barbara's marriage to Alexis didn't last, neither did her next marriages or the ones after that. She went on to marry 7 times in total, including to Cary Grant, the Hollywood actor. But in every case, the pattern was the same: men drawn to her fortune, Barbara yearning for love, and heartbreak at the end. She became the cautionary tale of her generation, proof that money could buy jewels, mansions, and titles, but never happiness. Then there was Doris Duke. If Barbara was the Woolworth heiress, Doris was the tobacco heiress. Born in 1912, the same year as Barbara, she inherited a massive fortune from her father, who built the American Tobacco Company empire. Doris grew up in luxury, and like Barbara, she was watched constantly by the press. She too had a string of marriages and affairs, though unlike Barbara, she wasn't as eager for royal titles. Doris poured her energy into philanthropy, art collecting, and a famously eccentric lifestyle. She built Shangri-La, her mansion in Hawaii, which became a showcase of Islamic art. Doris was nicknamed the richest girl in the world. But behind that label was the same theme: wealth did not protect her from loneliness. The same pattern repeated: money made her a target, not a partner. And then, perhaps the last truly famous Heiresses Royal marriage, Wallis Simpson. Now, Wallis wasn't technically a dollar princess. She wasn't a Vanderbilt or an Astor. She wasn't even an heiress. But she was American, and she married into royalty, famously, disastrously. In the 1930s, Wallis, a twice-divorced woman from Baltimore, captured the heart of Edward, Prince of Wales. He was heir to the British throne. The relationship caused a constitutional crisis, because in Britain, at that time, marrying a divorced woman was scandalous, especially for a future king. Edward refused to give her up, so in 1936, he abdicated the throne. He gave up being king, all for Wallis. Which in theory sounds like a grand romantic gesture. In practice, it was messy. Edward became the Duke of Windsor, Wallis became his duchess, and the two of them spent the rest of their lives drifting from one European villa to another, largely shunned by the royal family. Their marriage was strange, often described as dependent to the point of unhealthy, but it marked a turning point. After Wallis, no British monarch was ever going to marry an American socialite again without caution. So what changed? Why did the era end? Several reasons, actually. First, money stopped being the only measure of status. By the 1920s and 1930s, American socialites could gain fame and prestige through media, cinema, or philanthropy. A Vanderbilt could host the Met Gala. A Hearst could build a castle in California. A Hollywood actress could become just as glamorous as a duchess without the headaches of marrying into European nobility. Second, the European aristocracy itself lost power. After 2 world wars, many noble families were stripped of their estates, their influence, or their relevance. Some survived as quaint relics, some adapted into business or politics, but the old dream that marrying a prince guaranteed status was fading. And third, the world simply became less enchanted with titles. Americans, especially, started valuing celebrity over nobility. A movie star was exciting, a duke was dusty. By the mid-20th century, The dollar princess era was over. And yet, the fascination never really died. Think about Grace Kelly, an American actress who married Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1956. She wasn't a dollar princess in the Gilded Age sense. Her family was comfortable, but not tycoon level. But her story echoed the old pattern. An American woman, bringing glamour and money, marrying into a tiny European principality. Or Meghan Markle in our own time, an American actress marrying into the British royal family. The parallels are obvious. Different context, same fascination. So maybe the era ended, but the story never really left us. It just changed form. As we drift toward the end of this history, it's worth pausing on what it all meant. For the heiresses themselves, the marriages were rarely fairy tales. They were arrangements. Some endured them, some ran from them, some tried to turn them into love stories with mixed success. For Europe, the marriages were lifelines. Without American money, many noble families would have collapsed even faster than they did. The heiress dollars patched roofs, restored estates, and kept titles afloat just a little longer. And for America, the marriages were symbols, proof that the new world could buy its way into the old, proof that dollars could stand toe-to-toe with dukes. It was all glitter, all performance, and under the surface, it was often deeply sad. So if you're listening to this as you fall asleep, here's the gentle takeaway. Behind every headline of American Girl Marries Prince was usually a very human story. A young woman who might have wanted love, or freedom, or just a little kindness, and instead found herself as the glittering solution to someone else's financial problem. The castles were cold, the jewels were heavy, and the dreams, more often than not, quietly dissolved into loneliness. So here we are, the end of the line. The steamships have docked, the grand balls are over, the tiaras are tucked away in museum cases, and the heiresses themselves, most are long gone. But their stories linger, don't they? Because the dollar princesses weren't just society fluff. They were, in a strange way, a mirror of their world. They showed us how wealth and power shifted across the Atlantic. They revealed the fragility of old European aristocracy. And most poignantly, they remind us that even the richest women of their time were often just pawns on someone else's chessboard. Let's take one last quiet walk through the gallery of their lives. Consuelo Vanderbilt, married off at 18, paraded through a cold palace, her dowry shoring up the Blenheim estate. She became the poster child of the dollar princess era, not because she loved it, but because she embodied its contradictions. Rich, yet powerless, a princess in name, but a prisoner in reality. Her later divorce and independence were victories, yes, but quiet ones. Mary, later shy, clever, maneuvered into becoming Lady Curzon, Viceroy of India, the perfect hostess in glittering Delhi. Yet behind the scenes, fragile health, exhaustion, and a life cut short. Her name was engraved on monuments, but her own desires were barely remembered. Anna Good, who financed palaces, endured scandal, and married not one but two French aristocrats. Her fortune became their lifeline, her reputation the sacrifice. She lived surrounded by splendor, yet hounded by gossip until the end. Jennie Jerome, fiery, restless, not content to sit quietly while her husband spiraled. She had affairs, she had adventures, and she mothered Winston Churchill. She bent the rules in her own way, but even she couldn't escape the shadows of scandal that followed her. And Barbara Hutton, the so-called poor little rich girl, millions in her bank account, and yet she spent her life searching for love in all the wrong places. 7 marriages, jewels by Cartier, palaces by the dozen, but never the thing she needed most, stability. They were painted as winners of some great prize. They were photographed in gowns, stepping into carriages, walking down cathedral aisles with princes at their side. The newspapers called them lucky. The gossip columns called them glamorous. But when you listen closely, the stories don't sound like triumph. they sound like melancholy. And maybe that's the irony that makes this whole history oddly soothing. For all the glitter and grandeur, these women weren't so different from anyone else. They wanted affection, freedom, respect, and more often than not, they didn't get it. Now, if we zoom out, we can see why it all happened. The dollar princesses existed because two worlds collided. America had money, Europe had status, one without the other felt incomplete, so they stitched themselves together with marriages. It was never about romance. It was about survival, financial survival for European estates, social survival for American families desperate to prove themselves more than new money. And the daughters, they were the glue, whether they liked it or not. After 2 world wars, the glue crumbled. Aristocrats lost their power. American wealth found other outlets, mansions in Palm Beach, skyscrapers in Manhattan, art collections in Los Angeles. The heiresses no longer needed castles, they could build their own kingdoms. Yet in our imagination, the old dream lingers. Even now, we're fascinated when an American marries a royal. Grace Kelly, Meghan Markle. It feels like a fairy tale, even though history has shown us, again and again, that fairy tales are rarely gentle behind the scenes. So what's left of the dollar princesses? If you go to Blenheim Palace today, you'll see Consuelo Vanderbilt's legacy in the very bricks. Her dowry kept the estate alive. If you walk through Paris, you might catch sight of the Palais Rose, once Anna Good's pride, though it's long since been torn down. If you wander into biographies of Winston Churchill, you'll find Jennie Jerome, her American wit shaping his British destiny. The castles stand, the portraits hang, the jewels sparkle in glass cases, but the women themselves, the lives they actually lived, have mostly faded into whispers. And maybe that's the perfect bedtime thought. History often remembers the men, the dukes, the princes, the prime ministers, but in the quiet margins, the women carried just as much weight. Sometimes literally, the weight of family fortunes, dowries, jewels, expectations. Sometimes emotionally, the weight of loveless marriages and endless gossip. They were the gilded scaffolding of their age. Shiny, decorative, but holding up far more than anyone gave them credit for. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine those steamships crossing the Atlantic, trunks full of gowns, nervous heiresses on deck, watching the grey outline of Europe appear. Some hopeful, some resigned, some maybe just seasick, all about to step into roles that would define them, but rarely fulfill them. Imagine the drafty castles, the cold stone corridors, the jewels that pinched after hours of wear, the polite smiles at endless banquets, the lonely sighs behind closed doors. And then imagine the silence afterward, the fading of the headlines, the heiresses growing old, their names slowly slipping out of fashion, their portraits gathering dust. Because in the end, the dollar princesses were not fairy tale heroines. They were simply young women caught in the machinery of wealth and status. Their lives glittered on the outside, but on the inside, they were as fragile, as human, as restless as anyone else. And with that, we close the curtain. The heiresses are asleep now, the castles are quiet, the ocean is calm, and so hopefully are you. Good night.